So let's talk about Watchmen.
If you insist. All right.
The opposite problem.
Yeah.
The opposite problem. You've got another Alan Moore movie, and one of the reasons you mentioned The Boys, and one of the reasons I really have not had an interest in watching The Boys is like, we already did this.
Yeah.
We already deconstructed superhero mythos. It was called Watchmen.
Yeah.
Which is a movie that has all the superhero tropes in them, but it's dark. The superheroes are all flawed.
Very.
They're very flawed, and they have, emotional problems. They're characters. It's an already existing deconstruction of the superhero mythos, whereas The Boys just feels like, an inversion. Right?
In some ways.
The good guys are really the bad guys. And it's like, clever. Up is down, black is white, freedom is slavery. Even at his worst, the comedian is not purely a bad guy.
Right. Yeah.
And even at his worst, even Ozymandias isn't purely a bad guy, even though he's really the bad guy of the story.
Yeah.
But his motives are completely understandable from a certain point of view.
Yep.
So that to me is a more proper deconstruction, because it really gets into the what would this really be like?
No, yeah, absolutely. And I think the great thing, this is just sort of an aside for me personally about Watchmen in general, like one of the things I love about just that comic is, Alan Moore basically shines a light on, like, what kind of fucked up individual would actually want to be a superhero.
Sure.
Here's all of their psychological baggage, and you get an exhaustive look at it throughout the book.
And if you think about it, that's really there for any of them. Like, we all know what Batman's problem is.
Yep.
And really, Superman has kind of the same problem.
Yeah.
Also an orphan from the last son of a race that's gone forever.
Pretty much.
And Wonder Woman is, she's an exile? She's a goddess. She's like a demi-goddess. She's an exile from, they all have backstories.
Yeah, no, they all have issues, and that is sort of an interesting thing about, especially with the sort of the DC, what do you call it, Justice League. Many of them are essentially outcasts or pariahs, the last of their line, or something like that. But the thing that makes Watchmen interesting is just this idea that people that would actually want to go put on this costume and run around and fight crime are probably pretty screwed up.
Yeah.
And prior to Watchmen, nobody had really, this hadn't really been something that was widely discussed, or it wasn't sort of the central focus of the story. I think there were probably other comics before it that sort of pointed at, hey, this guy's a little messed up. He's the hero, but
Dark Knight Returns, right?
Yeah, oh sure, and Daredevil for that matter.
Sure.
But but it wasn't front and center like it is in Watchmen. And with the movie adaptation, I feel like they tried to be a little too faithful, to the comic. And they didn't have the squid, and that was fine.
That's really fine. The way they made that ending for the Watchmen movie. Honestly,
it was fine.
It makes a little more sense.
It does, yeah. There was no squid. And the funny thing to me was there were people that actually complained that there was no squid. And I was like...
Fanboys.
Yeah, and I was like, are you fucking kidding me?
Fanboys.
Yeah.
They want to see it done in the perfect way. And it may be that Lord of the Rings is to blame for that.
Oh, yeah.
Because Lord of the Rings was the perfect adaptation of a massively famous series and world that has had huge following throughout the world for, a good, at least the last 50 to 70 years.
Oh, sure.
And nailed it.
Yeah.
Nailed it.
Yeah, and...
There's there are people who complain that Tom Bombadil isn't in it.
Oh, sure, yeah.
But those are fanboys.
Yeah. Well, and there's the bit with, oh god, what's his name? Boromir's younger brother.
Barrymore.
Yeah, there's a bit in, I forget.
It's the second movie where he's like tempted to like take the ring from Frodo, and people are like, "That's not Faramir," and they're right.
Right.
But as in a movie, you need that moment.
Right, well, and Jackson made the right call, because in the book, he's just like, oh, well, I have no desire to possess that ring whatsoever. And you're like, oh, well, that would be actually really anticlimactic.
That would be anticlimactic in a movie. In a book, because Faramir's not that important in that part of the story. He becomes important later on.
Yep.
But in that part of the story, he's not that important. But in a movie, you need that beat.
No,
and I think that's really what narrowing in at the thing is like. Watchmen was an incredibly devoted attempt to recreate that graphic novel, shot for shot. And when I say shot for shot, I mean it's like they tried to like focus a camera on the graphic novel and recreate those scenes. But honestly, the part of that movie that's most memorable is the beginning musical montage with the Bob Dylan song.
Yeah.
To me.
Yeah.
The times they are a-changin', which tells us the backstory about everything and adds to the backstory.
Sure.
Like in the graphic novel, it's just the comedian makes a joke about JFK.
Right.
He just makes a mordant joke.
Right.
Which is why that Before Watchmen comic book series was BS.
Oh, yeah, no.
Because the comedian's like hanging out on the Kennedy compound. It's like, that's crap. That's not the comedian. You know, he's sitting there being sad with Moloch, and they're like hugging it out when JFK gets shot. Like, the comedian really is going to be sad when that's not going to happen.
No.
That's not going to happen.
No.
You read the character wrong. Anyway, but like that wasn't in the graphic novel. In the movie, it like pretty much shows him on the grassy knoll, like cocking his rifle after the fact with a cigar in his mouth, running away.
Right.
Like, bold choice, not in the graphic novel at all, but that really worked. Like, that told us a bunch of things about a bunch of characters we haven't met yet, and everything else felt very, yep, this is what happened. Yep, I remember this. Yep, I remember this. It didn't give us an opportunity to surprise.
Yeah, no, there was that, and it's also, I think, you know, some of the dialogue, part of that was actually, you know, they used a lot of the dialogue from the comic.
They did.
And there are things that work on the printed page that do not necessarily work coming out of an actor's mouth.
Give me the example that sticks out most in your mind.
I think some of Rorschach's, like, you know, monologue or dialogue, some of the stuff that he does.
They do like have all of Rorschach's journal in there.
Yeah, and to me, I'm like, I think that it works when you're reading it, but it kind of just gets long-winded. It doesn't really work in a cinematic sense. And I think that was just sort of, you know, some of the issue with that movie was a lot of the dialogue was snatched straight from the comic, and
we were putting this in because we have to have this in because this is what's in.
Right. Because this is what they say in this particular scene, and we framed it, and it looks just like the comic. And I'm like, well, that's great and all, but have you considered, you know, perhaps some of the efficiencies that film affords you? You know,
right? Like that whole scene in the owl after they do the rescue.
Yes. Yeah.
And the sex scene.
Right.
And you know you've got Hallelujah playing in the background.
Right,
it's like, you're like, let's shut everything down so we can have this moment.
Right.
And it just felt tired. Like, we're going to just, like, take the whole plot that we've been building up, we're going to shut it down so we can watch these two characters boink. Because that's what's in the comic book.
Yeah, essentially. Well, and it's, you know, and it's like, they've got to wear the costumes in order to get excited. Okay, well, that's great and all. We've already established at this particular point, like, in the story that these characters are pretty screwed up. Like, did we really? Like, yeah, anyway. So.
I felt like they could have just, like, suggested it. Mm-hmm. And just let it go on. You know, like they used to do in, like, really old movies where, it was all just implied.
Well, like, and the one thing, like, so I went back and forth about that particular scene, about the sex scene in Watchmen, And I was like, you know what? Part of what they're doing with this particular scene in this movie is actually a meta commentary on action movies from the 1980s where you had like the gratuitous sex scene. And I was like, okay. I was like, I don't know if Zack Snyder's got enough of a brain in his head to actually like, make this point, but we'll give him the benefit of the doubt and just be like, yeah, okay, fine. You know what? This is because there's a ton of movies from the 1980s that are action films, and you're like, and now there's the gratuitous sex scene that goes on
because
that goes on for an uncomfortable like 2 minutes, and it's like a montage, and you're like, really? But yeah.
The two characters that have barely shared 5 lines of dialogue
they're
gonna have sex, and just because we're gonna cool it down for a second before the third act battle.
Right.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And speaking of Zack Snyder, poor Zack Snyder, poor abused Zack Snyder. Poor one movie Zack Snyder. He had one movie.
Oh, no.
Which was also a comic book adaptation.
300.
Everyone forgets that 300 was a comic book adaptation.
Yep. Well, and that was Frank Miller and
Frank Miller. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny because we mentioned Sin City was a faithful adaptation of a Frank Miller comic, and honestly, like 300 is also fairly faithful adaptation of 300 the comic, I guess. But I personally never cared for the comic or the movie.
Mm-hmm.
Just me personally, I didn't really care for it. But boy, Zack Snyder really did actually do a fairly faithful.
He did a fairly faithful, and it worked as a movie.
Sure, yeah.
300 worked as a movie. It had a beginning, it had a middle, it had an end. There was acts.
Mm-hmm.
It was logical.
It was.
I didn't know it was a graphic novel until afterwards.
Well, and he did actually. One thing that I will say for the adaptation, is the fact that Snyder did cut some of the wordier bits.
Right.
Some of the exchanges from the comic for the movie, and he wasn't, a total stickler for the dialogue that came out of the comic. So there is something to be said for that. That was another Zack Snyder film. He did 300, and then he did Watchmen, I believe. Yeah.
300, Watchmen, and what was that other goofy thing?
It was Sucker Punch?
Sucker Punch!
Yeah.
That movie that we wanted to go see, but then we didn't go see.
Yeah, I don't know. Some people, I know a few people that saw it, and they were like, oh, I really liked it. And I was like, nah, that's cool. I'm going to skip that one. And I think he did, oh God, what was it? It was one of the...
It was like he was trying to make Sin City, but he didn't know how.
Yeah, I don't know. I think he might have seen the movie Avalon.
Sure.
Which is which was done with it's almost entirely Polish cast, and it's a Japanese director, but I think he was basically trying to do that, but instead sort of do it for an American audience.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he did like the Batman versus Superman. I think he did the first Superman movie with Henry Cavill. Didn't he?
Man of Steel.
Man of Steel, that's what it was.
Man of Steel, which always makes me think of my favorite Superman graphic novel.
Which one?
Red Sun.
Oh, Red Sun. Yeah, no, that's a good one.
Because the reason it makes me think of that is because I'm a nerd, and I know that Stalin is Russian for Man of Steel.
Right.
I always think of that. Because that's like Superman's nickname, the Man of Steel, but that's Stalin. That's what Stalin means. And Superman Red Sun is basically a what if.
Right.
What if, instead of landing in Kansas, Superman landed in the Ukraine,
right,
in the Soviet Union, and became not peace, justice in the American way, but, revolution and international communism.
Right.
And it's a great deconstruction of the whole concept of Superman, because he's still Superman.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he's still a good guy.
Right.
but he's a faithful servant of Comrade Stalin, and when Stalin dies, he basically takes over the Soviet Union. He doesn't want to.
Right.
But he does.
Right.
And he doesn't want to turn people into robots, but he does.
Right. Because this is
Because this is how we will make a glorious revolution for everyone. And so communist Superman is genuinely terrifying, even though he's still Superman. He's still a good guy. In fact, that's how, spoilers, that's how Lex Luthor beats him at the end of the movie. At the end of the comic book. Lex Luthor beats him by saying, "Are you going to put the whole world in a glass box, Superman?"
Right.
And Superman says to himself, he just says, "I don't want to do that."
Yep.
And that, to me, got right to the heart of it, better than whatever Man of Steel was trying to do.
Oh, no, for sure.
I don't know if Snyder read Red Sun. It seems like he wants to with like some of that like fascist iconography.
I'm not sure. I think Snyder has some sort of something going on with fascism. I'm not entirely sure what it was, but I'm not calling him a fascist. I'm just saying there was kind of a pretty heavy like fascist tinge to Frank Miller's 300 comic, and then that was definitely preserved in the adaptation of the for film.
Right, but I think we're gonna get into weird shit now. But fascism is like Sparta fanboyism.
Oh yeah.
It's like Rome fanboyism.
Sure.
So it's like it's the retreat. Like ancient Sparta was the real deal.
Right. Well, no, and it's the Battle of Thermopylae, which is inherently like,
you can't fault the Spartans for that.
Right. And it's like, it is like, as a human accomplishment, and you have this very low number of guys essentially holding the line for a ridiculously long time at a choke point versus like overwhelming odds. Yeah, okay, they all eventually die. But like the fact that they did it is impressive in and of itself.
Right. It makes me think of
like I don't think that it should be propagandized and turned into like oh look, see,
something like that is inevitably going to be propagandized.
Probably,
that's self-mythologizing.
No, that's true. And the Greeks bring it up all the time.
Well, sure. When it happened, they were like Thermopylae and Marathon were their giant fuck yous to the entire Eastern world. It's like, you came at us, but you couldn't take us.
Right.
Because we're awesome.
Right.
And you know what? They're allowed to do that, as far as I'm concerned.
They were pretty major accomplishments.
It's like the Sioux celebrating Little Bighorn.
That's...
I don't know if they do or not, but if they do, they're kind of allowed to.
Yeah.
I can't fault them.
Yeah.
It makes me think of Starship Troopers.
Oh, God.
Which is another example where it's not a graphic novel, but it was a novel, and the movie was like almost a fuck you to the novel.
Mm-hmm.
It was like the movie almost purely satirizes the novel.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Which always annoys me because when I read the novel Starship Troopers, like, people call it fascist, but it's not. It's like, it's not Nazi Germany in space, it's ancient Rome in space, or ancient Sparta in space. They have that kind of ethos.
Sure.
It's we need to survive, so we will fight to survive kind of an ethos. It's not fascism or Nazism has always been like a desire to get that without earning it.
Sure. Well, no, I could see that.
Or I don't know.
But I think it's...
We've gotten political.
Well, that particular era of Heinlein's work is sort of... I've heard people refer to that as his, like, idealistic phase, essentially.
Right, it's like an exploration of the military ethos.
Right.
If a society was organized in this way, what would be its virtues?
Sure. And
how would it function?
Well, and considering we have a very real military-industrial complex, like, it's probably worth, like, exploring that at some point. And I think Heinlein did actually do that. But, the guy, what was it? It's the gentleman that directed the movie for Starship Troopers, Verhoeven.
The same guy that did...
RoboCop. Brought you Angry American Robot Jesus. Which
yes.
Is, yeah.
Yes, and he also did the What am I thinking of?
Basic
Instinct. Did
he
he do Basic Instinct?
Yes.
Yes.
He also did Showgirls, I believe.
Did he do Showgirls? Is
I
that him?
think so. I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
We're going to pause for beer while we look that up. We need to figure that out.
He did.
He did.
Yep, absolutely.
He did that, and he did that before Starship Troopers.
Yep.
As you just discovered.
Yep, that was
so
his...
Showgirls did not wreck his career.
It did not. NC-17 movie often will. But, I mean, this is the same guy that did Basic Instinct, so, I mean, you know.
Whatever. I don't know. How's Basic Instinct not NC-17? I remember seeing that once when I was a teenager.
Yeah, I saw it when I was a teenager as well. I was like, oh, wow, we're watching the Forbidden movie. And I was like, this movie's actually crap. But, yeah.
It felt like Dress to Kill. It felt like a De Palma movie where just like, surprise!
Yeah, no, it was pretty derivative, to be honest. But, it's okay.
But, you know.
It's the same guy that brought us Total Recall, which was a great movie, so.
True facts. All right, so we did Watchmen, we've done 300, we've done From Hell, we've done all of these things working either far away from the graphic novel or too close to it doesn't make a movie because a movie has its own logic. That visual storytelling has its own logic. And if you try to recreate a graphic novel, it's going to be hard to do that, where you can pull the characters out and you can make a movie of them because they're naturally cinematic. Do we need to talk about anything else? The cat is hanging out with us now.
It's true.
It's true. And I was just informed about the Sad Cat Diaries, and I just laughed really hard. So that was amazing. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Thank you for that. That was glorious. So we're going to wrap things up now, because we have rambled and gone through an entire crowler of pale ale, and we don't know right now if this is going to end up being something we want to transmit to the whole internet, but we're going to do it anyway, because that's how first podcast episodes work.
Absolutely.
So, I am Andrew.
I'm Mike.
And we are Shallow and Pedantic. Check out our
Facebook page
for Unnamed Journal, which is facebook.com/The Unnamed Journal. The magazine is free to subscribe to and free to read, and it gets updated quarterly, and everything that happens in that thing is pretty much our fault.
Yep.
Right?
All our fault.
Awesome. So, thank you all for coming. Have a good day.